Hello, in this clip I want to help you with your first steps of coding in Python. The environment in which we do that is a software which is called VS Code, Visual Studio Code, I think it stands for, and it makes coding much easier. So what we are going to work through is a workthrough which comes from the Eclair webpage. The Eclair webpage has sort of support for sort of starting programmers, mainly focused for economists or econometricians, both in R and in Python. So in R and in Python, what we are going to work through is this first steps workthrough in Python. Okay, so this website is going to be linked in the show notes, and you can get there. I assume that you have VS Code installed, and if you haven't, you should first go through this workflow, the installing workflow in from the Eclair webpage, where we show what you should do. Now, once you have loaded it and you start your software, you start VS Code, Visual Studio Code, you should see something like this. Okay, I'll explain a few aspects of this a little later, but let's get started. So we need to save our code somewhere. You can either do that in a pure script file or in a Jupyter notebook, where it's sort of easier to combine text and code. And on most occasions, that's actually a better way of working. So let's do that. You go to File, New File, and here you can choose Jupyter Notebook. You could also just use a Python file, but let's choose the Jupyter Notebook. So you get something that looks like this. And let's start first by writing some code. Okay. Actually, let's define an object. Let's call it object1, and let's say that should be 6 to the power of 4. And let's define a second object. Let's call it object2, and that should be whatever the result of object1 is times 5. Okay? And then actually let's print object2. So far nothing has happened. We haven't run the code, and we actually haven't saved our file yet. Let's actually do that first. I'll save that somewhere on my drive. I call it fs, and then it has this IPython notebook, IPYNB. That's the traditional extension. So I have this. I haven't done anything yet. In order to actually run the code, you have to run it. You can either press that little execute cell, or you can press Control and Enter. Okay, so we can do that. Control and Enter, and it will run everything in this cell of code. And you can tell it's code because it has this little Python note here that will become important in a moment. And so we have printed object2, and it tells us that it is 10. Now, does it really make sense? No, because we asked object1 to be 6 to the power of 4. It's certainly more than 10, and then object2 to be object1 times 5. So the next feature of using, and that's why it's nice to use VS Code to do Jupyter notebooks. You could also, that's a way to edit them straight in a web interface. We can say, let's look at the variables we have here. There should indeed be 2. The first one is what we think is 6 to the power of 4. But the result here is 2. So this is now where we have to use the very first and perhaps the most important coding technique. And that is, we have to search the internet. Clearly, we thought we calculated 6 to the power of 2, but it has done nothing like this. So what do? We go and search So we say Python, for instance. You have to say which programming language, and then say how do we calculate to the power of 2, for instance. And then we will learn that really in Python to the power is a double multiplication sign. So let's do that again. You say to the power of 4. Now we rerun the code, Control Enter, everything on this button. Now you can see that 6 to the power of 4 is indeed 1296, and therefore object 2 is 6480. Okay, so that was already a super important lesson. Use the internet. Now I said we want to use IPython notebooks because they allow us to combine text and code. Now what do I mean with this? You rarely, if you have a document, you rarely want to start straight with code. You want to have some text, and here this is called Markdown. So we can put a Markdown cell up here, and you can see that by that little Markdown. And so, for instance, we could say my first steps in Python. The hash is sort of a heading. Okay, that's a top level heading. And here you can say that this is my first attempt at coding in Python. And of course, I recommend that you do all of this. Okay, and then we have some code. So now, of course, we can close that and you can open that again. But let's say you want to share that with a friend to demonstrate, hey, I've done my first bits in Python. Now, a nice way to share that with people, even with people who don't do any coding, let's say your mom, you click on here on the little dots and you say export. And for instance, you say, let's export to HTML script. And we say export. And you will see on the bottom right of your code, it's sort of working. You can see that little runner here working, and then it's asked, do you want to open the exported file? So we say yes, and it's appeared over here. No, that's not where I wanted it. So here, and what it has produced is an HTML file which you can easily share, which has this text we have written, the heading and a little bit of text. It has the code, and it shows the result printed out. So this is just so that you immediately know what we are working towards here. It's basically just a way of combining text and code and the output of your code, and then you can share that easily. Okay, you also can share it as a PDF. That requires some other software in the background which you may not have. So a HTML is possibly the best way to go. So let's click that away. So this is just so you see what we are working towards. We'll achieve some more interesting things here in the course of this walkthrough. So that first bit of code was really nonsensical, so we'll delete it. We didn't really want it. You can delete cells here with that little delete button. So we want a new cell code. Okay, here we're having code again. And now almost always the very first thing you need to do is install some packages. So we can actually say that here, start by installing some packages. Let's just call it install packages or libraries. I'll use the two terms interchangeably. Okay. Now I'll say in a moment why we do that and what we do. So we'll certainly import a package which is called OS for operating system. And we will do something with that in a moment. I'll just create a new code block. What we're going to do is we're going to print what our current working directory is. So we imported this package OS. And if we want to get a function from that package, we use os dot and then get cvd for current working directory, and we put that in a print command. Okay, we print the combination of that text and then comma and then whatever this function outputs, and it's basically asking what's your current working directory. Let's just run that and see what's being said here. Current working directory is C PyCode. Okay, on my C drive folder called PyCode. Now, why is this important? It's important because in in just a few minutes, we will upload a data file. And Python needs to know where that data file is. And it will first look, by default, it will look in this working directory. So we will make sure that our data file will be saved to that working directory. Now, why did we have to import this package? Now, there's a lot of functionality that is by default included in Python. For instance, that print function here. Right? That was just available from Python right from the start. But this function, the tell me what the working directory is, was part of that OS library. So we had to import. Now, it turns out there's sort of two steps. If you want to use libraries, there's two steps. First, you need to install it on your computer. And that package has already been installed on the computer, and then you have to load it. And that's what that import thing did, is it loaded the package or the library. I'll tell you in a moment how you actually install a package if you don't, if there's one which you don't have. So, okay, that is great. And let's actually do the next thing. Next, we want to load the data. Okay, load the, and I'll tell you what we use, the Manchester accident data. So we will be working with a data set of car accidents that happened in Manchester in the UK. Before we do that, I actually want to show you one other thing. Let's say the working directory which we currently have, PyCode, wasn't the working directory you wanted to work in. You could then change this working directory with this command. It's the OS, so it's the same package, change directory command. Okay, and then you could put another directory in. For instance, you could say C, just the hard drive. Okay, so you could do that if you wanted to. I'm not going to do it now, as I'm already in the right directory. And you can look at the walkthrough for more details. Okay, I won't be as detailed here as in the walkthrough. So now we want to load the data. What we need for that is actually another package. It's called the pandas package. So we need to import another package, and I'll already import two packages here because I know we will need them. The pandas package and the numpy package, which will allow us to do a lot of calculations. So here we import them with the line import pandas as PD. Now, if I just imported it as such, import pandas, then I could then in the following access functionality from that package by calling pandas dot and then the function name. However, that's a little bit long, so I'll basically say import pandas as PD. That means in the following, if I call a function from this, I'll say PD dot the package name. You'll see in a moment how we are going to do this. So I'll just rerun this box again. It imports the other packages. So, and now we can import the data, and we know what command we want to use here. And we'll do it as follows. To make lines not too long, I'll define a new object called file name and give that the name of the file. And it's important that this is precisely the name of the file. This is a CSV file with Greater Manchester accident data. And then we call this function PD from the pandas package, read underscore CSV, because we're importing a CSV file. And what file are we importing? Well, the file I just defined in file name. Okay, and we load that into a new object called ACData. So let's run this. Now you see we've created two new objects. Firstly, file name, that's just a bit of text, and then ACData. So we basically have now imported the data, and you can already see the size here. This file is basically a big spreadsheet with 42,500 rows and 27 columns. Okay, the information basically on 42,500 accidents that happened in Greater Manchester. So let's actually, we may want to look at this information. You can double click on here, and I can see this spreadsheet. Now, when you do that for the first time, it is likely that VS Code will ask you, do you want to install an extension called Data Wrangler? And I suggest that you do that. Okay, that's really useful. It just shows you data quite nicely here in the spreadsheet. It allows you to see them in the spreadsheet. You can see in the top some sort of summary statistics important. You can see whether they're missing data for particular variables. You can see sort of distributions of these. This is just very useful. Okay, and once you double click on that, it opens this new tab, which is basically just a view of the spreadsheet. You can close that, but the data are still here. You can see the data are still here in ACData, and whenever you want to look at them again, you just double click again and you have the data again. So this is now all, so being able to know what variables or objects have been defined, super important for you to know, because that is the information you can use in your code. What isn't here, you cannot use. Right? It's as simple as that, sort of your workbench with stuff. So we've achieved a number of things already. Okay, importantly, we've imported some data. Now here I told you, you have to use this pandas package to import the data, because in the pandas package you get this function read underscore CSV, which allows you to import CSV files. Now it will be either, how do you know that? Okay, it's because perhaps you look at walkthroughs like the one here, or you get advice somewhere else will tell you, well, to do this, you need this package or this library. Now, what should you do if you don't have a library yet? And the first time you use it, the pandas and the NumPy library you perhaps don't have. Okay, so how do you remember? There are two steps. First, you need to install a library on your computer. You only do that once. And then you have to load it into your code. And you do that every time you use it. And that's the loading you do with the importing. How do you actually install? Now, my preferred way, and I'll only show you one here, otherwise that video will be too long, is that you open the terminal here. Okay, here's the terminal. You can also go to terminal, let's say new terminal. Let's do that, and I'll delete the old one. So this will look like this. Forget about that that code. Actually, it should have been using it before, so most likely it will more look like this. This is our current working directory. This is basically a way how you can communicate with your computer directly. Okay, and the way how you install a package, let's say you want to install the pandas package, okay, is the following: pip space install, and then the package's name, pandas. Okay, I wouldn't have to do that because I have done it already, but I can still press enter here. Nothing bad will happen. And it's basically checking is everything. It sort of tells me requirements already satisfied. Everything is there already. If you do that for the first time, there will be more messages running, scrolling through the screen. And in the end, hopefully it will say everything is fine, it's installed, and then you can use that import, and then you can import the package. So let's actually do a few more things with our data. Let's use a new code cell. Code cells could be very long, but let me make them quite short here. So ACData is our object with the data. So there's an interesting, and now this is a bit of new terminology, method. act data is a thing, okay, where we can go again to Jupyter variables. You see act data, it's what we call a data frame, okay, it's basically a spreadsheet, although data frames can be more complicated than spreadsheets. And objects or types of objects, they have certain what we call methods attached to them, and you access them by .info. For instance, sorry, one of the methods is called .info, and usually with empty brackets. So if we run this, so Control Enter, what you get here is basically some information about act data. Okay, so for instance, you see all the variables here, and altogether there are 27. Note that Python starts counting at 0. That's very important to know. Okay, up to 26, so there are 27 columns. All sorts of information. We'll look at some of them later. You can learn that there are 42,500, so a bit more entries. So for instance, that's what you learned. There's some other methods. For instance, describe instead of info. So let's run this. What this basically gives you is sort of summary statistics for your variables, at least for the numeric variables. Okay. In just see, you know, the mean, count, how many observations, standard deviation, where that makes sense. That may not always make sense. Let me actually go back to info. Okay, here for instance, you can also see what data type the variables have. Here, most of them have what's called int64. That's sort of an integer, so it recognizes its full numbers. It's not decimals. There are some here. There are two, date and time. They're called objects. Objects are basically anything Python can't really categorize as something specific. So that's sort of a fairly generic term, and often you may not want that. So here we can see these are dates and times. And if you look at these data, now here's another, we could again double click here, but let me show you another way of seeing some data. If you say another method is head, okay, what that does is it shows you the first 5 observations, the first 5 rows. And here you can see output date has this 01-01-2010. These are all dates. Times are 13.10. Now we immediately know what that means. Python doesn't. Okay, it's just a list of characters, numbers and characters for Python. That's basically what object is telling you at this stage. So let us actually stick with info for the time being, and let's create a new code cell. Now, it's often important when you do coding to access particular parts of your spreadsheet. That may be a particular variable only, or maybe just a certain observation. So we're just gonna have a look at how to do that. Let's actually write a little new subheading here. We sometimes call that subsetting data. Okay, how to access particular elements in a data frame. So we're in code here again. So I'll show you. Actually, I'll create an error message because I want you to see an error message as well. So act data dot, and now let's do the first one. I log 0. Let's run this. Okay, and we get an error message. Now I knew this was an error. This would create an error message, but I want you to learn that getting error message is totally normal. Happens to us all the time. I just have to fix the issue. Here the error you get is name act data is not defined. And usually the name of the error is, sometimes you get quite a lot of text here. You have to scroll to the bottom to understand what the error is. Act data is not defined. Why it says here act data? Well, programming languages tend to be case sensitive. So I use the capital A when the object name really has a little a. So let's do this one. Let's run this again. Okay. And this now worked. Now, what did we actually do here? Well, we used another method. So ACData dot something. So you used the method iLocation, sort of an index location, you could call it 0. Remember, Python starts counting at 0. So this basically located the 0th, the first accident in our data set. Okay. So we can, if you look at this accident number, it starts with 10, 22, 62. If you look at our data file, that should be the first one, 10, 22, 62. That's that first accident. It basically has accessed this first row of data here. And it just, in this case, just, prints all the, outputs all of the information for that first accident. Now, sometimes you want to access more rows than just one. So what happens, for instance, if we say 0 to 2? So now in mind, we are now accessing accidents 1 to 3, counting 0 to 2. So let's run this. Okay. It did something we expected and perhaps something we didn't expect. So it does now show us basically some rows of this data set, the first one again, and now the second one, but it doesn't show the third row, which is indexed with 2, although we set 0 to 2. Now let's see, let's change that. Let's say 0 to 4, and we rerun it. Now it shows us 0 to 3. Turns out when you use this, it starts with 0, but this is the first index it will not retrieve. You just got to get used to it. It's a bit counterintuitive if you come from a normal way of life, but it will become second nature very quickly. So this is one way of accessing data. We can also access particular columns or variables. Now what you then have to do is actually do the following. Let's say, what does this do? Okay, I inserted a colon, comma, 0 to 4. Now, this comma means everything before the comma, you're talking to Python about the rows, and everything after the comma, you're talking to Python about columns. So, for instance, actually, let's say row 0, column 0. What value should we get? We should expect this value here, because that's row 0 and column 0, i.e. the first column. Let's see whether we do get that. Indeed, we do get that. Okay, so what about if we want from row 0, first row, we only want to see variables 4 to 6. So 4 is represented by 3, 6 is represented by 5. However, if we include 5, we say 5 here, it will not pick 5 because the first one not picked. So we have to say 6. So we have to just think a little bit here. So now we have for the first row, we have information from variables 4 to 6. Okay. And that's just these 3 bits of information. And of course, you could get that for a number of rows, let's say for rows 300 to 310. And then that's what you get. Okay, so this is how you extract particular parts. If you want variables 3 to, or indexed 3 to 5, okay, if you want them for all rows, you use a colon here. Okay, you just say colon, comma, 3 to 6. And now we have everything. You see, it doesn't show you everything on the screen, but it has all the rows, but only 3 columns. So this ilog is super important if you want to access by index, okay, by counting which row, which column. Now, there's another related way of indexing, and that is not with ilog, but with log. Okay, so if we were to run this, if you take the I away and run that, we'll get an error message. Okay, and you see, oh, it's actually quite complicated. Don't worry about all of this. Okay, the arrow type is at the very bottom, cannot do slice indexing on index with these indexes of type int. It doesn't really explain a lot, okay, but I'll show you what we need to do and why this is useful. So let's do something interesting here. Let's go first. Actually, let's look at the act data. And there's one variable called number of vehicles. And you can see there's a maximum value here of 19. It's a bit tiny, so if you have a tiny small screen, you possibly can't see it. But there's information that the maximum number of vehicles involved in an accident was 19. Now that sounds like a pretty interesting accident. So let's see whether we can find that. So one way to do that is the following. Okay, we go to this and you can use that log. Right? You can do different ways to get there. Okay, but we could say, now which rows, remember before the comma is the row information. So which row do we want? We want the row where act data, and then we'll see what was the name of the variable. I forgot already what the name of the variable was. Number vehicles was the name of the variable, so I will just say number vehicles is equal to 19. Okay, that was the number. So we're basically now, let me just, this is clear, so it's a bit annoying. So what we want to do is we want the row, remember before the comma is the row information, but now it's not a number or which number of row, but it's the row where the number of vehicles involved in the accident is equal to 19. So let's run this. And what we get is indeed this. Okay, it turns out to be row 111, so the 112th accident, perhaps certain index, and it had 19 variable vehicles involved, had 13 casualties, and all sorts of information. You can actually find out where exactly that took place. Okay, all sorts of other information on this accident. So the log method, okay, you can use to pinpoint particular rows, and that's pretty useful. Now there are many other ways how you can access data, but I don't want to go through them here. This video is already getting too long. But if you go to the Eclair webpage and if you go to a walkthrough called General Coding Techniques, you can learn many more important and interesting things with that respect. So as I said, there's more detailed in the printed walkthrough, which is linked from below. But let's do a number of other interesting things. So let's investigate the data. Okay, so add some code here. And one thing you may want to do is to investigate this, so some of the variables. For instance, what does severity mean? There's a value of 2 here. So the first thing you may wonder is how many values are there actually of severity? So here's a line from the walkthrough. What do we do? Let me run it first. Okay, so we now have created this new object called unique severity. You can see at the bottom here, it basically has 3 values. Okay, so, 3, 2, and 1. And how did we get that? We went to act data, only the severity column. Okay, act data in square brackets in single quotes severity. And then we applied a method called unique. So .unique, and that gave us, if we take this away, if we just run it like this, we can see it. We get 3, 2, and 1. So there are 3 levels of severity. Now you may wonder, okay, what do they mean? And you could go to the data documentation, and there's a link in the walkthrough. But let's do the following. Again, code copied from the walkthrough. So what do we do here? Let me take that line away. We already know there's 3. So we access act data severity. Now we apply another method, .value counts, and we put that into a new object called severity underscore counts, and then we print just a bit of text. That \n means new line, and then severity counts, and should be a parenthesis. So let's run this, and now that's what you get. Okay, so we get for severity count 3, we get 35,000 accidents, for 2, 6,500, and for 1, 582. So from this, you can already tell that 3 means slight accident, and 1 is the category for the most severe accident. So that's the only way that makes sense. So once you know that, it actually may make sense to turn this severity count from an integer variable that takes a numeric value 3 to 1 to what we call a categorical variables, where we can actually give the categories names, and you don't have to constantly remember that 1 means severe accident, okay, or serious accident. In fact, it means fatal accident. So here is how we do this. Again, I just copy the code from, let's create a new code cell from the walkthrough. And so here's what we do, is we again use, you can see this act data in square bracket severity, and we apply another method called as type, and then one type here is called category. That's, you just got to know that this is how Python calls this type. And what we do with this is we define a new variable, act data severity f for what for, okay, perhaps should better be severity c for severity category, where we basically use the same information as in severity, but define it as a categorical variable. Then what we do is we take that, I should have a C here then again, we take that new variable, and then we apply another method called cat rename categories. And then we say how these categories should be called. Well, what is a 1 should be called fatal, because remember that was the rarest type of accidents. It's a fatal accident. 2 is called serious, and 3 is called slight. And that's the terminology used by the Manchester police. Actually, so here we go. That was just hidden by my image. 3 is slight. Okay. And then we just print basically the same we did up here, the value counts for that new variable severity. Actually, I'll leave that. I already know I should change that into a C, but I want to show you another error message. Okay, so we run this. We get an error message as predicted. Let's scroll to the end. Key error, severity F. Okay, it doesn't know severity F. Hey, what is that? That's not the name of any of our variables. That's not a surprise. We have severity, and we have severity C, but not severity F. And that's because I had named that differently. So let's rerun that. And now we see, we basically get the same numbers, but now with our category names, slight, serious, and fatal. And that means from now on, you don't have to remember that 1 is fatal. Now at this stage, you're possibly asking, hey, Ralph, how should I know that to create a categorical variable and then to rename the categories, I have to use these 2 methods? Well, you're not expected to know. And in fact, I don't know all of these things on the top of my head. And let me introduce you to now the second important coding method. Now, we already had 2 very important coding techniques. We searched the internet, very important. That was the first one. And you could call it now 1B. It could be that now you could also use ChatGPT, for instance, or any other generative AI engine, if you describe your problem in enough detail, that can give you a solution. And in the walkthrough linked, you can see how I would propose the problem to ChatGPT to get a solution. So if you said, hey, I have this variable, I want to create a categorical variables with new names for it, then you can sort of get that. But there's some art to it of how you ask to get a useful answer. So we're not going to do this here. And of course, so that were techniques 1A and 1B, search the internet or asked Gen AI for solutions. And the second one we now already encountered a couple of times is that you have to deal with error messages and, try and see what is wrong. And usually, very often it's that either the thing which you've mistyped something or the thing which you want Python to use doesn't exist or the package isn't installed or loaded. Okay, that's the most common ones. So, and because this recategorization was so much fun, we'll do it with one more variable. Again, I'm just copying and pasting code from the walkthrough. We'll do that with the road surface variable, okay, because there's information for every accident, what sort of road surface, how the road surface was. And turns out that the categories here are dry, wet, snow, frost, flood, oil or diesel, or mud, okay, on the road. This you find from the data dictionary, which is linked in the walkthrough. I'm basically applying exactly the same lines of code here, just with road surface instead of severity, and you need these new categories. So let me run this thing. It's all right. I now called this new variable road surface F. I could have called it road surface C again, but I haven't. And now you can see that more than half of the accidents happen on dry roads. Then there are around 13,000 on wet roads, only 530 on frost or ice, and 220 on snow. That's because it doesn't snow a lot in Manchester and doesn't get super cold. Okay, so that was just the same. And the last thing I want to do in this video is just a bit of what are sometimes called crosstabs, okay, or contingency tables, because a lot of data analysis really includes that. They are super useful. Okay, so just to have some text here, so a bit more code. And again, how do you know how to do these crosstabs? You will have to search or find some instructions. Here's how we do it. There are several ways, always. So we're creating a new object, frequency table, and we're using a function from PD. Remember, if you forget, look at the top where you imported the functions. PD, that's the pandas package. Okay, so it's something from the pandas package, a function from the pandas package called crosstab. And here you just say which variables. So from act data, the weather condition F, and from act data, severity F. Now, I remember we changed that to severity C for category. So we create this new object and then we just print it. So let's do that. Now we get an error message. Why would that be? So let's find out. Weather condition F. Weather condition F. It doesn't like weather condition F. Okay. So why does it not like this? So we have to investigate. Well, we didn't create weather condition F. We have a variable called weather condition. So we can look at that, and sometimes actually I'll show you something else. Code. Okay. We say act data.columns. Sorry, that is a method without parentheses. You get a list of all the variables. Okay, and we see there's a weather condition 1, but not weather condition F, because we didn't create it. Okay, we only created new categorical variables for severity and for road surface. So we could go and you can look in the workflow, you can do that. But what we actually do is we change that to the one we already have, which was called road surface. Road surface. So we run this. So what you now get is this cross table. Okay, so now you can see that there were 388 fatal accidents that happened on dry roads. 179 fatal accidents happened on wet and damp roads. Okay, and so there's only one accident that was fatal when the road was flooded. Right, so this is super important bit of information you can see here. And then we had, I will just say as a reminder, these are the columns. So this is the end of our walkthrough. Okay, this was really, we assumed here that this is your first go at coding in Python in VS Code. Don't forget to save, and don't forget to share your great work with a friend to perhaps convince him or her to also do some Python coding together with you. Click on the more actions buttons here, then on export HTML, and we export this. We did that before, so we replace. You'll again on the bottom here see that it's working, exporting to HTML, and now it's done. Would you like to open it? And we say yes, we would love to see our work. And you see an HTML file which you can share via email. It's on your computer, it's not on the internet. Okay, and you can see all the work, and you see this great combination of code and output of code and your text which you included. Okay, the new heading here, the investigate heading. So that's a super way to share some work with someone. So I hope that this walkthrough helped you quite a bit. Remember, in the bottom in the notes to this video, you'll find a link to the Eclair webpage and to the particular walkthrough here, and you'll find many, many more useful resources on that webpage. Thank you very much.